Hi everyone and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the new DeathWing Knights from the DeathWing Assault Box. We are going to be paying special attention to the main areas such as the armour, metallics and the cloth, and you'll be pleased to know also that there is no airbrushing in this video. Everything that we paint in this video is entirely done via the brush. So first things first, what we need to do with the DeathWing Knights is, I have done this in a sub-assembly. So sub-assemblies do really help, especially to get like into the arms and areas like that. So I would highly recommend doing that as well. And as you can tell here, we have gone for two head options. This is the hooded and the helmeted option. This is the sub-assemblies, so I'll keep the head separate and also the shield. So it's, in my eyes obviously, I would advise doing that, but again, this is entirely up to you and how you want to paint it. And I have primed this in Colourforge's matte black spray. Firstly, we're going to be taking a look at the armour. So these are the colours that I have used for the armour, which is Mournfang brown. Because we have got a matte undercoat, it's going to take a little bit to build up, but it's also going to play into the style that we're going to do. XV88, balor brown and Morgast Bone, and then later on, when we come to our final stage, we'll be using a little bit of Wraith Bone and also throwing in a little bit of White Scar as a final highlight on some certain sections. Now, as you can see here, I have got one of the Artist Opus dry brush / stipple brushes, and that's going to be the main method that we're going to be using for the armour. Now, you don't have to use Artist Opus brushes. There are lots of brushes that are like this in these like fat dome shaped ones, and I would highly recommend these sort of brushes for this method. Now, the reason we're doing it like this is because as we start going up the layers and building it up, it sort of builds up like texture and chipping on the armour, and it is also quite a quick way of actually getting paint onto the armour. Now obviously you are going to get a bit of like what we'd class as like over dabbing or over stippling onto certain areas. That's not a problem. You do get that with airbrushing as well, but obviously just pay special attention if you're wanting to avoid certain areas, and that's why we're starting with the armour. Now, all the paints that we're using in this are thinned 50-50 with water. Depending if your paint's a little bit thicker, you might want to add a little bit more water to it. It will go on quite light, but because we've got that matte like black undertone as a primer, it does dull down quite a lot, and there's nothing wrong with going over this with multiple layers. So don't just think you've got to put one layer on, then another layer, and it's entirely true. It depends on how dark you want your shadows, whether you want to start with like the Mournfang brown or just jump straight to balor brown. Again, this is entirely up to you, but I do like mine a little bit contrasty and to add extra texture. And that's basically what we're trying to achieve as we're going up each one of these layers. It's just each layer is going to create another layer of like volume, texture, chipping and battle damage to the armor. And it's not until the final stages, which we'll get into in a little bit, is where the real magic and like tying it together starts to come. Because a little bit later on we are going to be adding a wash to this, because again, you know, you do sort of need to give these a wash with a stipple method. Again, it's a bit like an airbrush. You've not got much control where it goes into like the crevice areas and stuff like that, but it is a really quick, easy way of achieving a great look to your armor. And as we start to move up each layer now, you can sort of tell, and this is just using two colours, and you can sort of see that like stippling and that like chipping that's starting to take effect. And obviously with each layer, that you can sort of see through each one, and it leaves certain sections and just overall gives the armour that like more like I've said earlier, like a weathered look, and just gives everything a little bit more texture than just being like a flat area to look at. Now, when we start to get to the final colour, which is the Morgast Bone, what I do, I switch to just a slightly smaller brush, and rather than dabbing everywhere and going to each area, I'm going to start to pay special attention to the highlight areas. So this is just going to be areas that have, you know, like the top of your shoulder pauldrons and like the chest area and your knees. These are going to be areas that you want to be in a highlight. And again, you don't have to do that, but you know, if you want to add some of that shade into it and really like add a bit of drama to each miniature, then I'd highly recommend paying special attention to certain areas. Now you will have to add multiple layers of each layer, and I would recommend doing that just to build up those tones, because you're going to have a pretty dull looking miniature if you don't put like maybe 2 coats of each colour on, or maybe 3. It's entirely up to you. Now before we get into our final wash phase, where we're going to add some washes to it, I mix a tiny little bit of the Wraith Bone, our like brightest colour, to the Morgast Bone, and again I just pay special attention to those highlight areas. Now again, once we have done our like wash areas, I will be switching to a normal brush, but there's nothing to stop you actually going back to this stippling method if you want to add some additional highlights, and now and again I do have that. And with this, it's also a bonus, because if you want to add some more shadow, you can actually work backwards with it. You know, there's nothing saying that it's step 1, step 2, step 3. This is, you know, painting is sort of universal in a way with your colours. You can work forwards, backwards, sideways, and add bits, take bits away. And again, it's all just preference, so there's nothing wrong if you. And I think I even did that after the wash phase. I went back in stippling, and I even added a little bit of shadows to certain areas. Before we move on to our wash phase, I want to quickly talk about the greens. Now, I do my green in a different green to what Games Workshop paint their Dark Angels. I'm not really keen on that green that they do. So any green sections that you might have on your armour, I'm going to base coat them in the exact same way as what we've already done, but we're going to be using Lupercal green, followed up by a 50-50 mix of Sons of Horus green and Calibite green. And then we're going to finish that off with a tiny little bit of ice yellow inside there as well, just to do some final highlights. Now, all colours will be in the description below for all you colour police that like to know every single specific shade, tone and everything. But again, if you don't like this green, this is experimental to you. You could use something like Dark Angels green, Caliban green, and however Games Workshop do it, depending on the sort of green that you want. I tend to like mine more of like a cool green, more like leaning towards turquoise colour for my Dark Angels. Again, but this is entirely up to you. Now, one final stage that we're going to add before we get into our washes is I'm going to add a little bit of sponge chipping. This is done by obviously the sponge, and then I go in with a brush and just make some a little bit bigger and like on the edges and stuff, and just tidy them up and add some scratches before we move on to our wash phase. So for the wash phase, there's 2 options for this. I use Serafim Siepia, and I just literally splodge this everywhere, try and like water it down a little bit, make sure it's not pooling in certain areas, and even get some like a clean brush with some water on and just push it towards those crevice areas, because that's the main areas that we want it to sort of shift to. But you can also use the contrast paint, but I would recommend watering this down again to like a wash consistency, which is Skeleton Horde. But you know, it's entirely up to which one of those 2 colours that you prefer. And just work my way around it, you know, just any pulling areas, wick up away with a clean brush. And you might think, oh god, it's going to shift the colour of the miniature, but we are going to be fetching a little bit of this back, but it's mainly just to get into those crevice areas and change the tone a little bit more to a bony colour. Then what I do is I get a little bit of Agrax Earthshade, and I just I put that into certain areas what are going to be a bit more shadow that I want to stand out a little bit more. Making sure I'm putting it around, you know, like into the really deep crevices, like around his neck and where the helmet's going to be and stuff. And this just, you know, makes each area a little bit darker, and again adds that little bit more contrast to it. And then just give that a few moments to dry. Now there's going to be a bit of a time jump here because I forgot to record the base coat of the metallics, but essentially I base coat out and black out areas that I want to be black for painting next. The metallics are base coated in Decayed Metal by a Scale Colour 75. It's one of my favouriteest metallic colours, and then I just go over all that with the contrast paint Rattling Grime, and when you're done you should have something that looks like this, and it's nice and grimdark. And because of all that work we've done, first of all, that's just adding to all the chipping, and you know, it just makes everything steer without using enamels and stuff towards that grimdark look. One final thing I did was add a really light dusting of a matte varnish over the entire miniature, and this just gets rid of any like glossy from the wash phase. And you can see now we've got a really nice chipped / textured / scratched grimdark armour, and now we're going to come back to the armour because we do want to get rid of some of that like sepia tonish, and we'll start working up some of those highlights. Now This is really simple. I firstly start off, and I'm only going to be paying special attention to like highlight areas. Now we're going to start off going back to the Morgast Bone, and we're going to use that to cover some of the areas that might have gone a little bit too sepia, or that we don't want, because we don't want them looking like Death Guard or anything like that. But it's just a case of I've got it thinned down again, 60% water to 40% paint. So it's quite a thin paint. I've barely got anything on my brush. And I know I teach this a lot in my videos, like this scratchy, like sketchy effect. And that's basically the secret for this. And we're just going to be working our way around the miniature, tidying up all those little areas and adding some additional scratches and highlights here and there. And then we're going to work up to Wraith Bone, which is going to be one of our main highlights to certain areas. And you can go in there and add some edge highlighting. And also under each of the chips and stuff that we've done, you want to be adding a small highlight underneath them just to make them look a little bit more 3D. But the secret to this is just literally like the scratchy effect, and it just building it up again. You can do this in multiple layers because we've got that thin paint on there. Each additional layer is going to get brighter and brighter. And then finally, for the final highlights and areas that are really going to be shining, like the top of the shoulder pauldrons and maybe just a bit of his kneecap and part of the helmet, we're going to add a tiny little bit of white scar to the Wraith Bone just to make those areas stand out as one final like bounce highlight, or like really highlighted area. And that is your armour finished. Now, other additional areas that I do want to quickly speak about is his tunic, and that is painted up using the exact same colours as what we did for the green earlier on the armour. Just quickly go over them. So it's Lupercal green base coat, a little bit of 50-50 Sons of Horus to the Calibite green, and then a little bit of ice yellow as a final highlight. And I've got quite a big brush here, and I'm just literally sort of dry brushing and sketching this on. I did go a little bit bright with the highlights on it, and what I did was get the Lupercal green and thin that down with some water as like a little glaze, and just went over some areas just to knock them back a little bit. Now the metallic areas, these were all dry brushed after, so I used Runlord Brass, and I just gave all the areas just to highlight in a dry brush over, and then I mixed a tiny little bit of Mournfang steel in with the Runlord Brass as one final highlight, dry brush over all the metallic areas. It's also a good idea at this point, if you want to go this far with weathering, if you want to add some rust streaks, you can do that. And also to the metallic areas, I added a little bit of watered down verdigris, which is the Nylock oxide from Games Workshop. To finish off, I'm just going to quickly show you how I did the eyelenses on this miniature. I went for the blue with this one just to match his tunic. I know they're supposed to probably be red. Again, this is entirely up to which one of these that you want to do. If you want to learn the red version, then jump over and there'll be a link in the description to the Terminators that I painted up for the DeathWing. I'd used a different colour scheme for that, so if you want to learn that, and that does use an airbrush, then head over to that. And you know, there's nothing wrong with using an airbrush and mixing it with this method. And for all these little trinkets and red bits and stuff like that, I do teach that in my other video, so if you want to jump over there after this, then feel free. But the eyes, because they're sort of already white with everything that we've been doing, it is just it's Pterodon turquoise, the contrast paint, and then it's deep sky blue for the highlight, which is an AK paint, or any sort of like really saturated like light blue. Even a Games Workshop alternative would work fine for that. And then finally just a bit of white, so it's just a little white dot in each corner for the eye lenses. And I just sort of like the blue and how they look, like the turquoisey eyes on these knights. And that is it for our DeathWing Knights. Now, obviously, I did paint up another one with a little bit of like gold-looking different armour and the red eyes. And again, if you want to learn the colour scheme for this one, then jump over to the Terminators, and I go into a little bit more detail with some of the different colours. And that's also an airbrush video. And there's nothing wrong with combining both of these methods. Like for your highlights, you might want to do an airbrush with them. And again, it is just all experimental and entirely up to you which version that you like, or if you want to combine a little bit of both. But if anything, what I want you to take from this video is a little bit of experimentation from there. Now, I hope you have enjoyed this video, guys. It would help me out massively if you could just like this video and give it a thumbs up and comment and share it on your social medias. I've probably got one more video coming on the DeathWing, like Terminators and Knights, and that one we're going to go balls to the wall Grimdark. We're going to be using like chipping fluid and all that sort of good stuff. And again, this is just so you've got a bit of nice variation on which ones that you want to use. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, guys, I will catch you in my next one. Cheers for watching, and bye.